Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon if you're joining us from Europe. Warm welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Dalibor Rohac, or Rohac, if you will, if you're still using the Central European accents. And I'm a resident scholar here at AEI, where I work on all things Europe, including the EU, post-communist transitions, democratic backsliding in post-communist Central and Eastern Europe, as well as transatlantic relations. And I'm delighted to kick off this really exciting panel discussion on a subject that is extremely concerning to policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic, namely the Kremlin's influence operations and hybrid warfare more broadly. For years, Russia has been providing support to political extremism in Europe, has tried to leverage economic and energy tools to destabilize Europe, has looked for fissures to divide and sort of throw off balance and confuse. And unlike the Soviet Union, Russia today doesn't really have an ideological agenda to export. It merely seeks to divide, throw the West off balance, keep it distracted, and that way the regime can both pursue its ends in its immediate neighborhood, and also claim to the domestic population that the only alternative to domestic stability, even if it comes at the cost of oppression, is chaos that the Russian public sees outside of Russia. The Kremlin has seized the opportunities offered by the pandemic. It's been peddling its vaccine to European governments at the time when the EU and European countries struggled with vaccine procurement. Obviously, Kremlin has not provided much information about the effectiveness or safety of the vaccine. Nobody has been vaccinated by the Sputnik vaccine in some of the countries that purchased it, such as Slovakia. But the subject has dominated the discussion for the good part of the past 2 months. It led to the fall of one government in Slovakia. It led to the departure of a foreign minister in the Czech Republic, a very pro-Western Atlanticist foreign minister. So from the Kremlin's perspective, it is a success. If you can only think otherwise, if you really believe that the purpose of the Kremlin's vaccine diplomacy is to vaccinate people. So we'll be touching on some of these subjects in the coming 50 something minutes that we have, and I'm thrilled to be joined by this illustrious panel to touch on these subjects. And I'll introduce the panel in alphabetical order. I'll start with Jakub Janda, who is the executive director of European Values in Prague, one of the leading security and foreign policy think tanks in the Czech Republic. It just cannot be stressed how influential and important this organization, which really is a relatively small operation, has been in shaping the Czech debate over foreign policy, strategy, transatlantic relations, hybrid warfare. I think the influence of European values has gone way beyond the borders of the Czech Republic, and Jakub's leadership actually has been very instrumental in that regard. He's also the first European think tank to open an office in Taipei later this year. A very, very impressive move, notwithstanding the bullying of the Chinese regime. Edward Lucas, who is joining us from Somerset, is a writer who has specialized in European transatlantic security and has written extensively about Russia for years. He's a veteran of The Economist, where he wrote really quite relentlessly about Putin's regime, about its true nature, about its plans. His 2008 book really is remarkable. The New Cold War is remarkable in anticipating so much of what has since come to pass in great detail and sort of great level of granularity. So I'm thrilled he has set aside some time to talk to us today. And finally, our good friend Maria Snegovaya is joining us from Virginia Tech, where she is a postdoc at the Kellogg Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. She also has an affiliation at George Washington University, where she's a visiting scholar at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. She has worked on party politics, on sort of European politics more broadly, political behavior. She's written extensively about democratic backsliding in post-communist countries. She's written on Russian foreign policy, published in major academic outlets, including West European politics, party politics, post-Soviet affairs, Journal of Democracy, Democratization. Her work has been featured in New York Times, Washington Post, and many other outlets. And I'll leave you in the very capable hands of my illustrious AEI colleague Ivana Stradner, who will moderate the conversation. Ivana is a UC Berkeley trained legal scholar who is currently a Jean Kirkpatrick Fellow at AEI, where she is developing a sort of two-pronged research agenda, partly on international organizations and the role of international law in holding authoritarian regimes to account, and partly on the Western Balkans, and particularly the role played by Russia and China in Western Balkans. I should say that this is a public event which is being live streamed on our website, on our YouTube channel. Everything you say is on the record. I hope that won't prevent you, I hope that you won't pull any punches as a result of that. And I should also tell our viewers that they can start asking questions either by emailing our colleague Lance Kokonos, lance.kokonos@aei.org, or on Twitter using the hashtag AEI Hybrid Warfare. And without any further ado, I'll now hand it over to Ivana. Thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Dalibor, for your introduction, and good morning, everyone from DC. And I would also like to thank our panelists today for being with us and discuss this important question on hybrid warfare strategies that Russia has used across Europe and the impact of Putin's influence operations. So the main issue that I would like to discuss today and try for all of us to better understand is considering the Biden administration's pledges to strengthen transatlantic relations, how can Europe and the US work together to counter Russia's malign activities? So in March, US intelligence agencies issued a report saying that Russia carried out operations to try to interfere in the 2020 US elections. And Maria, you wrote a report on Russia's influence operations in the US. And I would like to ask you if you could please share with us your insights on Russia's hybrid warfare objectives in the US, and if you can compare that to Europe. And if the means and methods differ, does that actually indicate that Russia has different objectives in Europe than in the US? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ivana, Dalibor, and American Enterprise Institute for having me. It's a very important and timely talk, obviously. So to answer your question, Ivana, at least based on my understanding of the existing findings on Russia's operation in the United States and Europe, the goals are more or less related in both regions. And that is primarily, yes, as you have mentioned, to undermine the transatlantic alliance, as well as more broadly weaken the existing liberal international order, so to speak. And in an effort to do that, Russia implements very similar tactics, so to speak, with an effort to sow domestic discord, disrupt, and discredit democratic governance, as well as undermine the US and the EU international standing and influence. What differs in both regions is actually the strategic opportunities existing on the ground. So in Europe, for example, you have many countries with significant shares of Russian-speaking population. That legacy of perhaps, communism and some kind of links to Russia, that provides many opportunities to exploit this pro-Russian sentiment, try to essentially sow discord using the Russian population, and it's easier for Russia to reach out to its groups through its channels. Like, for example, Russian TV, as I'm sure other speakers will comment on that, is actually quite a powerful tool, and it's very competitive in many Eastern European regions. So it's easier, in some ways, for Kremlin to sow discord because there's such large groups that are very amenable, very susceptible, or receptive to the messages that the Kremlin sends, particularly given overall dissatisfaction that evolved as a result of the transition in this region, as well as Euroscepticism. In one of my recent publications, Party Politics and the Russia Foundation, I actually showed that one particular quality that pro-Russian, so to speak, parties have in common is that the electorates share Euroscepticism. Whether on the left or on the right of the political spectrum, Euroscepticism is one particular characteristic that electorates of these parties have in common. The other quality specific to post-communist region is high cultural conservatism, which again just trying to play out this sentiment. Overall, combining the findings, we see that at least my perception is that the Kremlin's approach is very opportunistic. If there is an opportunity, it's going to try and exploit that opportunity. And the other quality, of course, is the flexibility of the Kremlin approach. It employs a variety of actors, directly or indirectly linked to the Kremlin. You pretty much are guaranteed that if a certain, oligarch is in one or another way connected to the Kremlin, at some point, he or she, usually he will become some kind of a promoter of the Kremlin interest. There's also a variety of actors that are not directly linked to the Kremlin, quasi-private, and that allows, of course, a lot of flexibility in implementing the goals. Going back to the report, thank you very much for mentioning that, the one we published with my co-author from Japan, Kohei Watanabe, on the influence and interference in the United States domestically. We call it a moving target. And essentially, the essence of our finding is that despite very successful actual counter effort implemented by the US intelligence community and the policy community, we still see consistent interference of the Kremlin in the US domestic political process, and it evolves, hence the name the moving target. Because there was a lot of successes in identifying and blocking these actors, the Kremlin has gotten quite much better in hiding from this identification effort. So many of the Kremlin-linked actors, bots and trolls, they actually adopt much more lively personalities. They try to resemble real humans better, and they also learn to speak better English. It's actually an important identification strategy. So from that perspective, they actually now even copy large chunks of English text by native speakers in order to pretend that they're real American, for example, citizens. We also find that they try to hide the origin of the message more, because being associated to the Kremlin, to Russia, has become increasingly toxic, especially in the US domestic political process. That is, by the way, quite different from Europe, based on what I understand. And therefore, they try to hide the original message through a series of narratives laundering operations, so to speak. Also, in somewhat, I would say it's an achievement of the counter operation, because it was the Facebook and Twitter have identified a very successful effort in have implemented very successful effort in promoting and blocking pro-Russian linked actors. In recent years, we see that the Kremlin actors actually move to smaller platforms, which are less good in identifying those actors, as well as, for example, using closed chat rooms, private Facebook groups where there is less regulation and there is less monitoring as well. So in this sense, it's a kind of we're observing cat-mouse game between pro-Kremlin actors and the US intelligence effort and the US actors' effort to block and identify those groups. Finally, where we actually differ from the report by the US intelligence is that in our analysis, we actually use a number of quantitative and qualitative techniques. We actually see that, as in the past, the Kremlin tries to engage the groups on both sides of the political spectrum. So the US intelligence actually concluded that it was primarily on the right. We see these activities to be directed towards groups on both far left and both sides of the political spectrum. Many of you may have heard about these platforms, Peace Data and Nayok, which are unfortunately they're not quite, so to speak, it's not very appropriate wording in Russian, especially the platforms were especially kind of mockingly named after some I've seen words in Russian, but those were the platforms that were designed to engage the groups, the naive, unsuspicious Americans on both sides of the political spectrum in order to write and promote pro-Kremlin narratives. So that is another similarity, actually, with what we see in Europe. Very opportunistic, very kind of indiscriminately, non-ideological, regardless of right or left leanings, nature of the Kremlin's approach, trying to engage domestic groups in order to disrupt the liberal order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this excellent explanation how Russia has used malign activities both in the United States and in Europe. And when I think about Europe and Russia's hybrid activities, I always think about Ukraine and 2014. And I'm wondering, how has Russian hybrid warfare evolved since then in terms of methods, objectives, and tools? And what hybrid warfare tools has the Kremlin employed during the ongoing Russia-Ukraine tensions? And I'm wondering if you can provide example as to how the Russian methods and tools have changed basically over the past 7 years, even if their objectives to create instability, as you mentioned, has not changed. So any of you, maybe Maria or Edward?
So is that for me? Hello. Yeah. Well, I'm in some difficulty here because I agree very much with what everybody has said already, and many of the points I wanted to make have been made by Dalibor and Maria already. I suppose the key thing I think we need to bear in mind is that the disinformation is getting more sophisticated, and as it's getting more sophisticated, it's getting harder to spot what is exogenous and what is endogenous. And so if you see, whether it's anti-vax or anti-lockdown or any kind of anti-systemic material now, even with quite detailed analysis, it's hard to know, is this a local person inside our system who's got a justified grievance? Is it someone who's got a sort of unjustified conspiracy theorist grievance, or is it being amplified from outside? And that's really hard now. It used to be very easy to spot Russian and Chinese propaganda because it was so bad. And there's a sort of Darwinian process that it's got better, and that makes, as Maria was saying, we have a sort of cat and mouse game. I think the other thing that is really important to bear in mind is that all this really works because of mistakes that we are making. This is a bit different from the sort of completely invented propaganda that we've seen in other information operations, that it's basically relying on real problems that we have. You know, there's real skepticism, particularly among people of color, particularly in the United States, about the medical establishment. That's the basis for vaccine hesitancy. The European Union really did botch badly its response to the pandemic. We saw barriers going up all over Europe. The whole idea of the sort of Schengen zone was given a real kicking, and particularly in the Baltic states, for example, which suddenly found they were cut off from the rest of Europe because Poland had just put up a land border. Russian propagandists made hay with that, but they were able to make hay with it because it had actually happened. That was a thing. The slow vaccine rollouts, these were real things. And I think that in the past, we've tended to look at information operations through with the sort of basic framework of analysis that they're inventing things. The Lisa case, there was a girl called Lisa, but she really wasn't kidnapped, and everything that was in that whole episode was made up. And there's been many other examples of that. And it was hacking and leaking, where something was taken from the private sphere, put in the public sphere, and there was sort of arbitrage around that. With these information attacks, they're not really based on hacking and leaking, and they're not really based on invention. They're based on real things that real people really do feel, and real events that really happened. And so, to my mind, the best counter to them is not to think so much about the information dimension, although it's worth doing what we can on that. The best counter we have is to make real people and real events be different, and make people have greater confidence in the system. Don't close borders. Don't muck around public procurement in a way that makes people sleazy or incompetent. And that cuts the ground from underneath these both Russian and Chinese information operations, I think, far more successfully than doing information-only tactics.
Anything else that, Maria, you would like to add and maybe make an emphasis on Ukraine?
Yes, thank you very much, Ivana. Very much follow everything that Edward has said. I forgot to mention that in our report with Kahir Watanabe, we actually find evidence of the Kremlin's successful fostering of polarization in the United States, since we actually run an analysis quantitatively and show that respondents in the United States on Twitter who more actively engage with content that resembles what Russian propaganda looks like. We didn't have the tools, unfortunately, to directly attribute those messages to Russian propaganda, but it was looked like something Russia would usually promote. So we see evidence of polarization in that sense, that engagement with such content correlates with less willingness to support the president from the opposite camp. We ran the survey right before the actually the US presidential election. So that is some evidence of successful effort to do polarization. On Ukraine, I have been following a little bit less, unfortunately, the dynamic in Ukraine in the recent years, but overall, our Atlantic Council team has done a lot of great reports on this topic, and with help of headed by Jacob Kalensky, among others. We also have the DFR lab that works on that. But they have identified essentially continued, of course, Russia's disinformation effort in Ukraine, this time more focusing specifically on domestic process in Ukraine. It's a little bit harder now, of course, after so many years of war, when the Ukrainian population is much less kind of predisposed and susceptible to the propaganda that the Kremlin sends. Plus, technically, some of the groups with more pro-Russian sentiments, like the Crimea or Donbass, are actually like less under Ukrainian control these days. So in some ways, it's actually a little bit easier for the Ukrainian government. Nonetheless, the penetration and disinformation effort in Ukraine today is massive. It's very much focused on domestic process to sow discord domestically, to challenge and undermine the politicians that are not favorable to the Kremlin, as well as more broadly create dissatisfaction and uncertainty around the way democratic institutions function in Ukraine. For example, in the last election, a significant chunk of the disinformation effort focused specifically on the election in Ukraine. There is also all sort of different kind of targeted attacks designed to make the say the actors that the Kremlin views more hostile, such as, for example, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, kind of to undermine the influence in Ukraine. So from that perspective, yes, unfortunately, it continues. And one of the results of this continued operation was the recent actually blocking of some of the pro-Russian channels by President Zelensky. It's a little bit of a debated, contested issue in Ukraine. I'm sure our other colleagues will be able to comment on that. But one particular problem in Ukraine I wanted to draw attention to, because, of course, of all this Russia's effort in recent years, starting with 2014, Ukraine, there was a lot of pro-Ukrainian sentiment in Ukraine, but in somewhat left out Russian-speaking population outside of the government kind of, I'd say, interest zone. That, in some ways, unfortunately, especially in recent years, given that Ukraine has not been particularly successful on its reformist track, it actually creates a lot of groups that, unfortunately, become susceptible to the disinformation operation by the Kremlin again. So therefore, one of the possible policy solutions, and I'm hoping we will be able to get there, is trying to reincorporate these groups by creating channels of information for them that are effective, that are competitive for the Kremlin channels, and at the same time integrate them into more pro-Western messaging. I don't think we should be repeating the mistakes that we have done in the past, right, which already allowed, provided the Kremlin with a winning tool, with a winning hand back in 2014. So that's one of the particular problems to which I think we should all pay attention.
Thank you very much, Maria. So Jakub, I think you also wanted to comment on Ukraine, and later on I would like to ask you actually about Czech Republic. So please share with us what you think about Ukraine, and then I have some questions for you about the Czech Republic.
I think on Ukraine is quite something similar what we have seen across other European countries. So what I just wanted to point out is that, I mean, Ukraine is a testing ground, unfortunately, for Russian aggression in military and non-military terms as well. So, I mean, if we are looking into, I mean, disinformation done by elite captured individuals, this is exactly what, I mean, we see China doing pretty well and pretty successfully across Europe, but Russia has been doing it obviously for, I mean, many years. We have seen it through the KGB active measures manuals in the past as well, during the Soviet Union era, and this is ongoing. But just what I just want to say is that Russia today is quite successful so far to actually co-opt individuals who actually do the Russian or Kremlin's messaging on the Kremlin's behalf. So those are not only outsiders or external players doing it in Ukraine against Ukraine or in Czech Republic against Czech Republic, but quite often those are local individuals who are actually co-opted for various reasons, who are working as de facto agents of influence of the Russian Federation. And what I see it as a major problem is that this is actually happening not only in Ukraine or generally in Central Eastern Europe, like in the region we or I come from, but very clearly this is happening in Western Europe as well. And I mean, we as generally speaking, the expert or national security community have been, I would say, relatively good in responding to some levels of the general disinformation tactics Russia does at the international stage. I mean, to some extent, there is some knowledge and understanding of this, even though we are not fighting back enough. But at the level of elite capture and how this is used for strategic disinformation by Russia, we are very much not successful. And I mean, obviously, Nord Stream 2 and Russian economic projects in Germany or France or countries like Czech Republic are quite successful. And the reason for it is that there is still a level of, I would say, understanding of normalcy, or let's say the normative line or norm is still quite low, which means that it's acceptable to actually be a proxy of the Kremlin quite often, do a pro-Kremlin messaging if you don't do it in a silly way, if you are quite smart how to do it. And so you could actually achieve a lot on behalf of Russian foreign policy interest or the Kremlin oligarchic money, depends on who is paying you. But this is still a major problem for many of us because, and we could see it very clearly now in the Czech Republic with which you mentioned, Ivana, with the GRU incident, which actually basically what happened was that we actually had a Russian military organizing a terrorist act or act of sabotage, which actually meant at the end that in 2014, two ammunition depots, two buildings with ammunition actually exploded on the Czech territory, killing 2 Czech citizens. Hundreds of Czech citizens had to be evacuated, and there were billions of Czech crowns used for repairing the damage. So quite a major damage for Czech Republic. And what we now know is that the GRU, Russian military intelligence, which de facto means Russian army, has actually organized and done this. So what I'm trying to say is that after this was revealed some 2 weeks ago from now, there has been a massive Russian disinformation operation engaged against Czech Republic. I mean, not only from Russia itself, but also within the Czech Republic, where we have had quite a lot of Russian proxies and assets who are now being mobilized on behalf of the Kremlin's messaging, like the Czech President Miloš Zeman, who is a Russian puppet, or a couple of our parts of our parliament on the far left, like like the Communist Party or the far-right parties. So I'm trying to say that this is actually a long-term problem. So when there is an incident where Russia is engaged in, like this GRU attack in 2014 in Vrbětice, one of a Czech village, what actually happens is that those individuals, those proxies and assets are mobilized. And quite clearly here in the Czech Republic, we could see they are quite successful in mixing up the messaging. So Czech Republic is not understood as a trustworthy ally by its allies, because if you look through the Czech political spectrum, who is in the government, who is in the presidential office, those people are not really trusted by our allies for good reasons. I don't trust them myself. So at the end, why would anybody really go out and help Czech Republic despite what happened? And we internally keep saying, look, 2018 Salisbury attack, what the Russian intelligence did in the UK, resulted in expulsion of 153 Russian intelligence officials with diplomatic cover from across Euro-Atlantic countries, mainly, and the closure of Russian consulate in Seattle. This is the benchmark of response. We might argue that this Czech case is much more significant because it's an attack on a NATO military facility, NATO state military facility to be exact. 2 Czech citizens died directly because of this. So I would, to some extent, I would argue it's a level of Salisbury or maybe a bit beyond that. But still, we are waiting for the response. And I'm afraid the response is quite limited. First, because of how Russia is successful in, Czech Republic is successful in not organizing and mobilizing its allies. And second, because the allies don't decide to do it that much because they don't trust Czech Republic and not trust and maybe do not want to go ahead with that. And just to finish up, obviously we will see more because clearly now there is more evidence coming up in Bulgaria. Exactly. Where it looks like the similar kind of GRU operation actually happened in some of the ammunition depots over there, and some Bulgarian citizens died because of this as well. So clearly this was a regional activity, not only in the Czech Republic. So I think we'll see more in upcoming days and weeks. But sorry if I was long.
No, thank you very much for this. This is exactly something also that I wanted to ask you. And just to follow up on this, can you also just briefly tell us a little bit about this new hybrid warfare strategy that was just issued in Czech Republic, because it's a fascinating document. So if you can just briefly comment on that, because right after that, I would like to ask you a follow-up question on the EU. So.
Yes. So what happened is that, in the Czech Republic, there are basically 2 groups of people. First, those international security institutions, most of them are on the good side. So our national security institutions more or less are quite good, I would say. The problem is that much of the political leadership in the current government is to some extent co-opted or corrupted. So which means that there is this disparity which you could see in many countries across Europe as well. So right now we have a strategy which is called National Strategy for Countering Hybrid Interference. Essentially what it is, it's really about Russian and Chinese influence in the Czech Republic, and what should Czech Republic do against that. Obviously it's just a policy document, so it's just basically a piece of paper which was approved by the government, which is good. But what it does is that it actually forces all the government agencies to work together, because that unfortunately so far has not been really the case, even in a country of 10 million, which doesn't mean that we are very big, but it means that quite often there is I would say old school understanding of like external security is organized by Ministry of Defense more or less, and internal security by Ministry of Interior. But obviously those things overlap a lot. There is a big and with the hybrid threats coming mainly from Russia, we could see very clearly how internal and external security actually is more or less one security altogether. So more or less that's the government document, but what is happening now is that the government is actually drafting an action plan. Much of it will likely be classified because it will be quite specific over what will be done internally in the Czech Republic for basically making it more resilient on quite many levels. Because after this GRU attack was revealed publicly, finally, even the current government, which is quite weak because it's dependent on the president's will, who is a Russian puppet. So it's hard politically, but now there's a public push to actually at least promise a lot. We will see how much of it will actually happen.
Yeah, good luck with that. And on that note, I know that you testified before the EU Parliament on a very same topic, and both of us were there. So, and I learned over there so many great policy recommendations. Given that it was several months ago, I'm just curious if you can share with our audience what the EU should do about this issue. And where is people over there? And given that even some EU countries are actually, if I may say, pro-Russian, on that note, how can we have like a solidarity on this issue?
I think a reaction to this specific GRU incident, actually what can happen is that EU countries can and should expel some of the Russian intelligence officers under diplomatic cover on their soil, something what we have seen after the 2018 Russian attack in Salisbury. That's exactly what should be happening. I hope there might be happening some of it soon. Only so far, I believe Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Baltic countries have responded so far. If maybe I forgot one or two, but more or less that's the case till now. But to my knowledge, more of it is coming, but it will not be huge, unfortunately. So that's the first part. But honestly, this is not deterrence. This is important. It is happening. But deterrence means that the Kremlin would look at Europe and say, look, we have done this, and they have really punished us, so we will not do this again. So I'm thinking, what else should it be? There are many options. I mean, only if the Europeans, if us as Europeans would look at the way how the US sanctions on Russia stand, for example, those sanctions on Russian oligarchs linked to the Kremlin, basically, if Europeans actually take US sanctions and implement them in Europe, I would say at least we have done part of it as well. Because, for example, there are many individuals who are on US sanctions list, but they are not on EU sanctions list. The example is Vladimir Putin, former KGB general, who is essentially a major proxy of Russian influence and intelligence in Germany, France, or Austria, or in the Czech Republic as well. But this individual is on the US sanction list. But Europeans are very happy that this individual is actually organizing Russian influence operations across Center and parts of Western Europe as well. So those people should not be allowed to enter Europe, for example, at least. And honestly, again, this would be a defensive measure. We as Europeans are entitled to defend our own soil, and so this would be purely defensive. But we are not even doing this as we should, I think.
Thank you very much, Jakub. So, Edward, you wanted to comment on this question as well.
Yes, I think there's two kinds of deterrence. There's deterrence by denial, and there's deterrence by punishment. And deterrence by denial is when you make the attacker feel there's not really any point. You know, if I try and attack Fort Knox with a pea shooter, my peas will bounce off the concrete. And I think that it's worth looking at the countries in Europe that do deterrence by denial in the information sphere. And chief among them, I'd say, is Finland. And the Finns, this isn't something you can implement overnight, but the Finns start off by teaching media literacy in schools to 7-year-olds. They have very close, cohesive links between the different parts of the information system, between media and government, law enforcement, intelligence. Everybody understands that Finland can be attacked with information, and they pull together. And the result is, I mean, if Russia still tries to attack Finland with historical narratives saying that Finns are fascists, that Finland tried to attack the Soviet Union, but it kind of bounces off really. And I feel that the Russians are to some extent losing their enthusiasm for attacking Finland because it just doesn't work. Whereas other countries, when they do it through history or polarization or any of the other things they've got, it does it works better. So I think in addition to what Jakub's been saying about deterrence through punishment, which is if you do any kind of hybrid threats against us, we will catch your spies, throw out your diplomats, put your people on our visa lists and so on. It's also just really worth digging down and seeing how the countries that succeed in this do succeed. And I think that there's been a remarkable reluctance in old Europe to learn from new Europe, perhaps I should say Western Europe to learn from the East. And in that sense, I put Finland as in the eastern half. And there's also been a bit of an unwillingness, I think, in the United States to think about the information system as part of democracy that can be attacked. There's a kind of default reflex to go straight to the First Amendment and say, well, that's the most important thing. And the First Amendment's fantastic. I wish we had it in Britain and in European countries as well. But the First Amendment is not in itself a defense of the information system against people who are attacking you with lies or hoaxes or scare stories. You need to think about it a bit more broadly. And there are countries that do this. So my plea would be, let's not try and invent the wheel again and again and again. Let's look at countries that are getting it right and do it. I'd also, one other point I think is very important is there's a danger of sort of reflexive control here. That one of the things that Kremlin would love would be if we would Putinize our own system in order to defend it against Putinism. And I think that we have to be quite careful about adopting sort of extraordinary measures against information attacks, because they actually take us off the moral high ground and make it easier for the Russians to say there's no real difference between your system and our system, and we ban radio liberty and you ban Chinese telly, so what's the difference? So I'm not saying we shouldn't do these things. We need to think very carefully about these sort of punitive measures and work out if they may be creating more, if adopting punitive measures creates more problems than they solve.
Thank you very much, Edward, for your comment. And on that note, I would also like to link that to your report on the coronavirus thing, because even Russia amplified false theories on the coronavirus, such as that the COVID-19, for example, originated in a US bioweapons lab. So I'm wondering if you can share with us the Kremlin's, again, objective tools and methods for the pandemic disinformation campaign as a specific example. And if you can share with us how effective the Russian disinformation campaigns have been in promoting false narratives about the pandemic, both in the US and in Europe.
Well, it's a huge subject, and I'll just touch on a few things. That I think the first thing to say is that this wasn't a step change for the Russians. They carried on doing things that they'd been doing before and did them in a more intense and sophisticated and effective way. But it wasn't like with China, where China went off in a new direction. We'd never seen China going down the fire hose of falsehood approach, and war for diplomacy was also quite is a new thing for China. So one has to see what Russia does in the sort of continuum of what they've been doing before. You're absolutely right that they recycled many anti-Western narratives. The West is failing. There's a sinister plot that the Western vaccines are being tested on innocent Ukrainians who are going to pay a terrible price for this, being laboratory monkeys for the Western pharma industry. The bioweapon you've mentioned, that of course echoes Operation Denver, which was a Soviet attempt in the 1980s to blame the CIA for the HIV/AIDS epidemic. That was particularly strong based in Georgia, and picking up the presence of the Lugar lab in Georgia and saying this was something very sinister. There's also, I'm quite interesting that one of the things one always has to remember about Russian disinformation is it's not homogenous. And just as I think Maria was saying earlier, they appeal to the far left and to the far right, and I'd say also to the greedy middle. So in Germany, it's the left wing, the AfD and Schröder, who all hate each other, but actually they're united by the fact that Russia like them. But equally in this, there was a strong heterogeneity in the messaging. So on the one hand, they were saying Sputnik is the best vaccine. It's the one that really works. Take it, you'll be safe. That's great. And at the same time, they were also saying vaccines are dangerous, and making out that there's can't be too careful. So the sort of I think we summarised it in our report by saying that the Russian line is both that the virus is simultaneously a plague and a hoax, and they went off from that in all directions. Let's all panic. Here's a fake cure, and watch out for those 5G towers. And I think the overall message is not the aim of this is not to have a particular outcome. They're not saying let's use this in order to get candidate X elected in election. Why? It's part of this general idea of corroding trust within countries and trust between countries, because when trust goes down, it becomes much easier for a country like Russia to get what it wants. And so in the end, they don't care what happens so long as it's bad. And that's a bit different from the Chinese messaging, which is in some cases is just straightforward corrosive, but also has a sort of more positive side of wouldn't the world be a lot better if it was run by China.
Thank you, Edward. And so I received numerous questions for you, and one of the questions that keep popping up is actually China-Russia cooperation in disinformation. And I would like to ask both of you, Edward and Jakub, and if you can comment on Sino-Russian disinformation cooperation in Europe. And can you tell us more about this cooperation and what happens, and what has Beijing actually learned from Moscow and vice versa? And do you see evidence of China CCP applying those lessons around the globe? So,
yeah. So I think China's late to this in terms of getting. I mean, Chinese efforts used to be sort of ridiculous in the way that Russian efforts were ridiculous 10 years ago. But they're catching up fast. I'm sure they have learned from Russia. I think one thing that was quite interesting was that Russia didn't try and blame China for the virus. 20 years ago, when I was the Moscow bureau chief of The Economist, the Russian press was full of sort of quite racist, sort of yellow peril, watch out, the Chinese are coming, and every sort of scare story and nonsense about the Chinese were both sort of primitive and sophisticated and sinister all at the same time. And that's all gone. You really have to search very hard in the Russian media to find anything that's kind of anti-Chinese. So that was one thing that they could have played that card and they didn't. We didn't come across any signs of real strategic coordination. There's a bit of narrative amplifying, stuff that was tweeted by one side and then it's retweeted by the other. But we don't think that there was a sort of high-level information summit where the sort of disinformation czars on both sides got together and said, right, how are we going to play this? It's been opportunistic on both sides. I think that the key message for the Chinese is we've got this. We have really dealt with the outbreak with our quite harsh measures, but they work, and so democracy is failing and autocracy or Chinese communist rule is working. And that was a very message, because for a time it did, if you forget the fact that the virus originated in China, that was quite a you could argue that the West's response was late and patchy, and the Chinese response was being pretty vigorous. I think there's one other thing that I'd mention is that the Chinese are really going for this hegemonic discourse control. They want to close down discussion all over the world if it doesn't suit China. So we saw in Germany, for example, they went after a children's book, just very anodyne children's book, which was a sort of aimed at German 8-year-olds, which just had the sentence, the virus, the outbreak started in China. And they organized a social media campaign and letter writing campaign, and they had diplomatic protests, and they got this German publishing house to apologize and pulp the book and produce a new edition, which does not say that the virus came out in China. Now, what's interesting about that is the level of detail and focus that it requires to do something like that. And secondly, you can't imagine the Russians doing it. If you imagine someone finding something comparable about Russia and putting it in a children's book and saying maybe Russian carbon emissions are melting the Arctic tundra and we're all going to die or something. I mean, however offensive it was to the Russians, the idea that the Russians would have the organization and the focus to target a particular publisher of a children's book and get them to withdraw it, you just can't really imagine it. Can you imagine Russians in Germany being organized to write hundreds and hundreds of letters, or the Russian consulate in Hamburg complaining? There's just a different level of attention. So I think that shows how much more. I mean, that's why I'm more worried now, much more worried by Chinese disinformation, because it's backed up by real organizational muscle. And in a way that the Russian effort isn't. On the other hand, more worried about Russia when it comes to other things, but not on the information side.
Jakub, can you also please comment on this issue?
I think, yeah, I fully agree with what Edward said. I think what Russia and China share are some of their strategic objectives in Europe. Not all of them, but some. And clearly, they align. They see the world in a similar fashion. They both want a revenge against the United States. They both want to, in a way, push out American US presence from Europe in any way. And they both want Europe to be, let's say, more divided or separated from US policymaking in national security issues. That's clearly what they both want, but they have different options how to do it. But clearly we have seen in the disinformation messaging, this is clearly what we've been seeing as well. I mean, China clearly tried to blame everybody. I mean, blame the US mainly for the pandemic, China tried to show itself as a savior of Europe, somebody who is saving Europe from the pandemic, when China tried to deliver medical goods, medical equipment to some places across Europe. And then I think the overall political or geopolitical map actually has become more transparent during the pandemic, because we have seen countries or states which decided to be, or which are long-term Chinese allies, proxies, or puppets, who essentially played again the Chinese card in this game. And clearly that's Hungary, that's Serbia. There are some efforts in other countries like Italy or even in the Czech Republic, where part of the Czech political spectrum essentially kneeled to China for no reason, to some extent for money, but basically this is what we have seen as well. So, I mean, to some extent, Russia and China share some of their strategic objectives. Clearly, we see China learning from Russian mistakes or Russian successes, because clearly, if you look through Chinese international broadcasting, they copy a lot from what RT has been doing, what formerly Russia Today, a Russian TV station, which is a channel or communication channel of the Russian state. Do not mistake it with journalism, but clearly this is exactly what China learns from. And I would say the difference is that Russia is seen as an urgent military threat across many places in Europe, not everywhere, but quite often it is, while China is not seen as a military problem for Europe, which to some extent is understandable if you think about only hard security in a sense of kinetic action, direct action. But if you think about cybersecurity, logistical security, or many other areas, now we finally have a NATO document, NATO 2030, which is basically saying, look, we need to prepare for the China challenge, China problem, China threat, as NATO, not only as the US or only as our militaries, but as NATO, as a political political military alliance, which is good, because now we have this move, which is important, because basically there is a big divide across Europe, where you see basically Germany and partly France pushing for a very soft policy on China in every regard. We have some elite captured individuals and governments across Central and Eastern Europe who are basically on the Chinese side, be it mainly the Hungarian government here, some parts of the Czech governments, previously some other people across Europe. But now we have countries across Lithuanians, Estonians, Romanians, partly Poland as well, even though Poland is much softer on China than others in this region. But so far we have seen there is a awakening on China, and there are wedge lines, there are dividing lines across Europe right now, and you could see that there will be a lot of question marks, or I would say political discussions and disagreements among European countries on China. It will be, and that's something what we, because on the Russia discussion, more or less the discussion is set across Europe. You see who is countries have their positions set, and they don't change much, regardless of what the Russian actions are. While on China, that's dynamic, that's changing, what the position of countries are across Europe.
Yeah, thank you, Jakub. And you actually mentioned a very important topic, which is the role of NATO. And in 2015, NATO adopted a strategy. So I'm wondering if, Maria, you could share with us the role of NATO in countering hybrid warfare operations. Because probably that will be one of the avenues when you can see the transatlantic cooperation on this issue, or if any other person like here would like to comment on this.
I will comment a little bit on the broader counter effort, which includes NATO operations as well as the other kind of institutions that partake in this endeavor. So what we see works and what we see doesn't work as well. First of all, the very issue at question here, I just wanted to add a little bit of optimism to our discussion, that the very fact that, as Edward has pointed out, for example, and I have mentioned as well, the Russian actors actually now actively looking out for local actors on the ground in the specific countries that are more favorable to pro-Kremlin narratives and essentially amplify those narratives. I think to a large extent it demonstrates the effectiveness and success of the counter effort. It's very toxic to be openly embracing pro-Russian agenda and openly affiliating to Kremlin, Russia more broadly in today contemporary US or European landscape. And that's exactly partly the result of what Jakub has pointed out. Because of the understanding of Russia and its influences, there's some consensus achieved with regards to the Kremlin and its malicious influence. So that is success. Another kind of successful policy, which we see also in our report, is actually identification, labeling actors as being associated to the Kremlin and Russia. It actually works quite well. It does reduce significantly engagement with discontent promoted by the actors. So this policy should be continued. Censorship bans also work, but they're more short-term. Unfortunately, it's actually just a short-term solution, and these actors tend to reemerge after some time. I do agree with Jakub that we need a much more consistent and well-developed policy of sanctions and essentially punishing, deterring the aggressor. There's no continuity. There's not a lot of alignment between the US and the EU. In that regard, the EU remains much more pro-Russian and too careful of taking harder steps. And honestly, at this point, one starts questioning them, ourselves, what is it that the Kremlin should do for the EU to finally awaken and to take more serious action against what is going on? Really, the Kremlin is organizing terrorist attacks all across Europe, and there is no significant counter action. So to go back to your earlier question, Ivana, some successful achievements, NATO counter disinformation activities as part of this effort were fairly successful, but there is much more to be done. But unfortunately, it's more of a political decision that requires some stronger commitment on the side of the EU politician to sanction and prosecute some of the aggressive actions on the part of the Kremlin's actors.
I was muted. I wanted to say, Edward or Jakub, would you be maybe willing to also comment briefly on NATO? We have 3 more minutes. So that was also one of the questions that I received.
If I may, on NATO, I mean, clearly we see there is, let's say there is a divide, which if I put it in very simple terms, there are countries in Europe who want to see, for example, if we are speaking mainly about China here at first, there are countries who want to take China only as a political and economic problem. That's mainly the big countries in Western Europe, Germany, France, Italy, partly Spain as well. So their preference is that Europe actually takes the China policy through the EU channels, which means that the voice of UK, US, and Canada is missing. And then there are countries which see China mainly as a national security and an economic problem. More or less, those are some countries in Central Eastern Europe, with the exception of Hungary, some of the Nordic or Scandinavian countries as well. And some of them are basically saying we are very happy with the American approach, which is now supported by the UK and Canada, Canada less, UK more, within NATO, which is let's really start discussing how we take the China challenge, which will take several decades for us, how we take it mainly as a strategic, military, geopolitical problem through NATO. I know this is not just a false dichotomy. I think this is clearly shows the complex of our real problems across EU member states, how we, generally speaking, see the China problem. And then on the Russia discussion, I'm afraid we don't see much of movement. So basically, regardless of what Russia does, what hostile aggressive actions Russia does, we do have some level of military response, which is good. There is a deterrence component in the Baltics, some of it in Romania in the future. But to some extent, we can push back against Russia in Ukraine to a limited extent. But if you speak about non-military Russian aggressive activities, I'm afraid we don't see much of movement for stopping it, because the current state of play is not what Europe likes, because Russia is still hurting us, still hurting our national security interests, still making damage to European democracies, and we as Europeans are not stopping it because we don't push hard enough. And it's not only about defensive measures, like building our own resilience. That's important, but at the same time, we effectively need to put harm to the aggressor so that the aggressor actually stops the aggression. I know this might seem theoretical, but at the end, aggression does not stop because we are more resilient. Aggression stops when the aggressor thinks it is not worth it. And we are not at that point of discussion among European policy circles anymore. I mean, we are not there yet, to put it that way. We are anytime Russia does anything really aggressive, look at recent cases in a recent 3 to 5 years, we only do symbolic action. We only do very symbolic sanctions. We put 2 or 3 local Russian policemen to an EU sanction list. It does not hurt the Kremlin at all. So that's our problem. That's what I think our main point of policy discussion should be in the future.
Thank you very much, Jakub. It was a very, very important discussion also in NATO, and I received so many questions on this topic. So apparently our audience is concerned as much as we are about this issue. And one thing that I have to say is that Russia's hybrid warfare operations are here to stay. And I genuinely hope that this discussion on hybrid warfare operations that Russia has used across Europe and the impact of Putin's influence operations help us understand a little bit more how can Europe and US work together to counter Russia's malign activities. Unfortunately, due to time limitations, I cannot ask all questions that I received. So I would also like to thank our audience for being concerned about this subject. And I would also like to thank all of you and Dalibor for joining us today and discussing this tremendously important topic. So given that US midterm elections are almost in 18 months, I really, really hope that the US can also learn a lot from experience in Europe, where I'm also coming from. So I also personally care about this subject, and I will thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.